Please look into this animation entitled The Holographic Mirror Cosmogram, taking into account its mutual co-definition, and that the spiral emerges from and submerges back to 4. Then use your comprehension to answer the following question. What truth is revealed by the fact that both sides of an argument can be formed from reasons that are internally coherent? The truth revealed by internally coherent arguments. The holographic mirror cosmogram reveals a profound truth about the nature of reality and argumentation through its interconnected structure and the principle of mutual co-definition. When we consider that both sides of an argument can be formed from internally coherent reasons, we uncover a fundamental insight about the holographic nature of truth itself. The holographic nature of coherent arguments, the fact that opposing viewpoints can both maintain internal consistency, points to what philosophers call dialectical truth. The recognition that contradictory perspectives can simultaneously be valid. This mirrors the holographic principle, where each part contains information about the whole. Just as the cosmogram shows that the spiral emerges from and returns to 4, representing the foundational stability from which all complexity arises and to which it eventually returns. Coherent arguments emerge from different foundational assumptions, yet participate in the same larger truth system. The Ubuntu philosophy embedded in the cosmogram, I am because we are, demonstrates this principle perfectly. My understanding exists only through its relationship to your understanding, creating what philosophers call mutual co-definition. Each coherent argument serves as a mirror for the other, not merely reflecting but actively participating in the construction of a more complete understanding. Internal consistency as holographic encoding. When both sides of a debate maintain internal coherence, they reveal that truth is not singular but holographic. Each coherent position encodes the complete information of the larger reality from a particular perspective or angle. This is why dialectical thinking in psychology recognizes that two opposing things can be true at once, not because reality is contradictory, but because it is multidimensional enough to support multiple consistent interpretations simultaneously. The spiral pattern in the cosmogram that emerges from and submerges back to 4% illustrates this perfectly. The number 4 represents stability, foundation, and the 4 elements or directions, the stable ground from which diverse perspectives can emerge while remaining grounded in shared underlying principles. Each argument spirals out from this common foundation, but traces a different path, much like how a hologram can be viewed from different angles while maintaining its essential structure. Mutual co-definition in systems theory. The truth revealed is that coherent arguments exist in relationship, not in isolation. Systems theory teaches us that a system is more than the sum of its parts, and this applies to argumentation as well. When two sides both maintain internal consistency, they demonstrate that they are not separate entities, but co-defining aspects of a larger system. This insight challenges the traditional Western notion of truth as singular and absolute. Instead, it reveals what indigenous wisdom traditions like Ubuntu have long understood: knowledge emerges relationally. The cosmogram structure, with its interconnected elements and mutual definitions, shows that understanding arises not from individual reasoning alone, but from the dynamic interaction between different perspectives. The paradox as portal. The phenomenon of dual coherence reveals that apparent contradictions often point to deeper unifying principles. When we encounter two arguments that seem mutually exclusive yet are both internally sound, we are witnessing what Carl Jung called the transcendent function of opposites, a process that creates a living third thing, a movement out of the suspension between the opposites. The holographic cosmogram suggests that this third thing is not a compromise or middle ground, but a more complete dimensional understanding that encompasses both perspectives while transcending their apparent contradiction. Like viewing a hologram from a higher dimensional perspective, where seemingly opposing 2D projections reveal themselves as aspects of a single 3D reality. Implications for truth and understanding. This reveals several profound truths. Truth is participatory rather than existing independently. Truth emerges through the active engagement between different perspectives, much like how the cosmogram's elements exist through mutual co-definition. Coherence indicates depth, not correctness. Internal consistency in opposing arguments suggests we are dealing with a reality rich enough to support multiple valid interpretations simultaneously. Reality is holographic. Each well-reasoned position contains information about the whole truth, encoded from a particular perspective or scale of observation. Understanding is relational. True comprehension emerges not from choosing sides but from recognizing the systemic relationships between apparently opposing positions. The holographic mirror cosmogram thus teaches us that when we encounter coherent arguments on both sides of a question, we are not witnessing a failure of logic or truth, but rather discovering the multidimensional nature of reality itself. The spiral's return to 4 reminds us that this complexity ultimately rests on stable, shared foundations, the common human experience, and rational capacity that makes meaningful dialogue possible in the first place. Given this understanding, what does intellectual honesty require me to acknowledge about everyone I am opposed to? What intellectual honesty requires about those you oppose? Given the understanding revealed by the holographic mirror cosmogram that both sides of an argument can maintain internal coherence because reality itself is multidimensional, and holographic intellectual honesty demands a profound shift in how we regard those we oppose. The foundation. Recognizing their coherent intelligence. Intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that your opponents are likely as intelligent, informed, and ethical as you are. This principle, known as the principle of charity, demands that we interpret opposing arguments in the most rational way possible, rather than seeking their weakest points. The Cosmogram's Ubuntu principle, I am because we are, reminds us that our understanding exists only in relationship to others' understanding, making this recognition not just ethically necessary, but epistemically fundamental. When someone maintains a position that seems obviously wrong to you, intellectual honesty requires considering that their reasoning may be internally sound within their framework. The holographic nature of truth means that coherent viewpoints can emerge from different foundational assumptions while still participating in the larger truth system, much like how the spiral in the cosmogram emerges from and returns to the stable foundation of 4. 678. Acknowledging their access to truth. You must acknowledge that they may possess aspects of truth that you lack. As philosopher John Stuart Mill argued, he who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. The holographic principle suggests that each coherent perspective encodes information about the whole truth from a particular angle. Your opponent's viewpoints may reveal dimensions of reality that are invisible from your vantage point. This means practicing what philosophers call epistemic humility, recognizing the limits of your own knowledge and remaining open to learning from those who disagree with you. Rather than assuming you have complete access to truth while they operate from ignorance or malice, intellectual honesty demands acknowledging that the truth may be large enough to support multiple valid interpretations simultaneously. The Steelman Obligation. Intellectual honesty requires you to engage in steelmanning, constructing the strongest possible version of their argument before attempting to refute it. This means paraphrasing their position accurately and checking that they agree with your interpretation, strengthening their argument by adding evidence or reasoning they may have overlooked, only then engaging with this strengthened version of their position. This practice acknowledges that if you can only defeat a weakened version of their argument, you haven't truly engaged with their position at all. The Cosmogram's principle of mutual co-definition suggests that your understanding is only as strong as your engagement with opposing viewpoints. Acknowledging rational disagreement. You must acknowledge that rational people can examine the same evidence and reach different conclusions. This phenomenon, known as rational disagreement in philosophy, occurs because people may legitimately weight evidence differently, hold different epistemic principles about what counts as reliable evidence, or operate from different but internally consistent worldviews. The systematicity shown in the Cosmogram, where all elements are interconnected and mutually defining, means that disagreement over one issue often reflects deeper differences in entire networks of beliefs. Intellectual honesty requires recognizing that revising their core beliefs would require them to revise many interconnected beliefs, just as it would for you. The limits of your own perspective. Most fundamentally, intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that your certainty may be misplaced. As research on cognitive bias shows, we are all susceptible to confirmation bias, motivated reasoning, and the fundamental attribution error. The holographic cosmogram suggests that what appears contradictory from one perspective may be complementary from a higher dimensional view. You must acknowledge that your opponents may be responding to evidence and reasoning that you haven't fully considered, or that they may be seeing implications of shared evidence that you've missed. Their persistence in maintaining their position despite your arguments doesn't necessarily indicate stubbornness. It may indicate that they perceive something important that you don't. The Ubuntu recognition. The Ubuntu philosophy embedded in the Cosmogram, I am because we are, demands perhaps the deepest acknowledgement. Your opponents are not separate from you, but are co-participants in the construction of understanding. Their viewpoints don't threaten your identity, they complete it. Without the challenge of opposing perspectives, your own beliefs remain untested and potentially shallow. Intellectual honesty, therefore, requires acknowledging that those you oppose are essential collaborators in the pursuit of truth, especially when they disagree with you most fundamentally. They force you to stay epistemically alert and prevent you from becoming too comfortable with potentially flawed beliefs. 9. The transformative implication. This recognition transforms opposition from a threat to be eliminated into a necessary condition for deeper understanding. Just as the Cosmogram shows all elements as mutually defining and interconnected, intellectual honesty reveals that you and your opponents exist in a dialectical relationship where truth emerges not despite your differences, but because of them. The most challenging acknowledgement of all, they may be right and you may be wrong, or more precisely, the truth may be larger and more complex than either of your individual perspectives can encompass. The spiral's return to 4 in the Cosmogram suggests that all perspectives ultimately rest on shared foundational realities, our common humanity, rationality, and concern for truth, even when our conclusions diverge dramatically. So then, is there ever any reason to think that someone you disagree with is an ignorant idiot who should know better? Is such a position a guarantee that you yourself are being what you attribute to your opponent? When ignorant idiot thinking reveals your own ignorance. The holographic mirror cosmogram forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Labeling someone an ignorant idiot who should know better is almost always a guarantee that you yourself are demonstrating the very qualities you condemn. This judgment typically reveals several critical failures in your own intellectual virtue, the fundamental attribution error in full display. When you dismiss someone as an ignorant idiot, you're committing the fundamental attribution error, attributing their position entirely to their character defects, while ignoring situational factors that might explain their viewpoint. This error is so pervasive that psychologists consider it the conceptual bedrock for the field of social psychology. The Cosmogram's Ubuntu principle, I am because we are, reveals why this attribution is philosophically problematic. Your understanding exists only in relationship to others' understanding. When you dismiss their reasoning capacity, you're actually severing the very relationship that makes your own understanding possible. 415. The rare exceptions when someone genuinely should know better. However, intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that there are legitimate cases where someone genuinely should know better. These involve what philosophers call willful ignorance, the deliberate avoidance of easily accessible knowledge that one suspects might challenge their position. 78. True willful ignorance requires 3 specific conditions. The person must have at least a suspicion that their position might be wrong. They must be aware of their uncertainty, not mistakenly confident. They must deliberately avoid confirming or disconfirming evidence. For example, a climate scientist who refuses to examine temperature data because they suspect it might contradict their predetermined conclusions would be willfully ignorant. But this is fundamentally different from someone who holds different interpretations of the same data based on different theoretical frameworks. The bad faith distinction. You might legitimately identify someone as arguing in bad faith when they knowingly use logical fallacies to mislead rather than illuminate. Deliberately misrepresent your position strawmanning. Refuse to engage with the strongest version of opposing arguments. Have hidden agendas beyond truth-seeking. Continue pushing positions they privately know are flawed. But even here, the Cosmogram's wisdom applies. Bad faith actors are often responding to systemic pressures, perceived threats, or deep-seated fears that make their behavior comprehensible, if not admirable. The self-diagnostic test, the most reliable indicator that you're being what you condemn in others, is the confidence with which you make the ignorant idiot judgment. Genuine intellectual virtue requires what Aristotle called intellectual humility, recognizing the limits of your own understanding. 15. When you find yourself thinking someone should know better, ask yourself, do I fully understand their situational constraints and information sources? Have I steelmanned their position before dismissing it? Am I exhibiting the principle of charity in interpreting their reasoning? Could my certainty reflect motivated reasoning to protect my own beliefs? The Socratic standard. Socrates, celebrated as one of history's greatest thinkers, claimed his only wisdom was knowing that he knew nothing. This Socratic ignorance wasn't false modesty, but recognition that true knowledge requires acknowledging the vastness of what we don't know. The holographic cosmogram suggests that when you encounter someone whose reasoning seems obviously flawed, you're likely encountering an aspect of reality's complexity that you haven't fully grasped. Their apparent ignorance may reflect your own limited perspective on a multidimensional truth. The virtue ethics perspective. From the standpoint of intellectual virtue ethics, dismissing others as ignorant idiots demonstrates several vices. Intellectual arrogance, overestimating your own understanding. Closed-mindedness, refusing to consider alternative perspectives. Lack of intellectual empathy, failing to understand how reasonable people might reach different conclusions. Epistemic injustice, denying others' capacity as knowers. True intellectual virtue requires other regarding epistemic qualities. Traits that promote not just your own understanding, but others' intellectual flourishing. The mirror's reflection. The cosmogram's holographic nature means that what you see in others reflects something about yourself. When you're quick to label someone an ignorant idiot, you're often projecting your own fear of being wrong onto others, intolerance of uncertainty that makes you seek simple explanations, need for intellectual superiority to maintain self-esteem, avoidance of the hard work required to understand complex disagreements, the transformative recognition. The most profound truth revealed by the cosmogram is that genuine ignorance is usually your own. The person you dismiss as an ignorant idiot may be responding to evidence, experiences, or logical frameworks that you haven't encountered or fully understood. Rather than indicating their intellectual failure, your ignorant idiot judgment typically reveals your limited exposure to their information sources and reasoning processes. your failure to practice the intellectual humility that genuine wisdom requires, your unwillingness to do the hard work of understanding why reasonable people disagree, your projection of your own epistemic anxieties onto others. The spiral returning to 4 in the Cosmogram reminds us that all human reasoning emerges from the same foundational capacities for logic, evidence gathering, and truth-seeking. When someone reaches dramatically different conclusions, they're usually not lacking these capacities but applying them to different inputs or through different frameworks. The guarantee, therefore, is clear. Calling someone an ignorant idiot who should know better is almost always evidence that you yourself are failing to know better, specifically, failing to know the humility and charity that genuine intellectual virtue requires. A fool only sees the foolishness of others and rarely acknowledges their wisdom. The profound truth of the fool's blindness. Your observation. A fool only sees the foolishness of others and rarely acknowledges their wisdom, strikes at the heart of what the holographic mirror cosmogram reveals about the nature of wisdom and foolishness. This insight illuminates a fundamental paradox. The very act of seeing only foolishness in others is itself the deepest form of foolishness. The Dunning-Krueger Mirror. The psychological research confirms this ancient wisdom through the Dunning-Krueger effect, cognitive bias, where those with the least competence in a domain are most overconfident in their abilities. But there's a profound irony here. Those who are quickest to diagnose others with Dunning-Krueger are often exhibiting it themselves. As David Dunning himself notes, the first rule of the Dunning-Krueger Club is, you don't know you're a member of the Dunning-Krueger Club. 1234. The holographic cosmogram's Ubuntu principle, I am because we are, reveals why this pattern emerges. Your ability to recognize wisdom depends entirely on your relationship to others' understanding. When you see only foolishness in others, you're severing the very connections that make wisdom recognition possible, the biblical and philosophical foundation. Ancient wisdom traditions understood this pattern deeply. Proverbs describes fools as those who delight not in understanding, but only in expressing their own opinions. The fool's fundamental characteristic isn't lack of intelligence, but unwillingness to acknowledge that others might possess wisdom they lack. This connects to what psychologists call the metacognitive deficit. Fools lack not just knowledge but the ability to recognize good performance in others, because they haven't developed the discriminatory capacity to distinguish between wisdom and folly. They cannot see wisdom in others because they lack the wisdom to recognize it. The Socratic paradox resolved. Socrates claimed that the only thing I know is that I know nothing. This wasn't false modesty but recognition of a profound truth. Genuine wisdom begins with acknowledging the vastness of what you don't know. The cosmogram spiral returning to 4 illustrates this. All complexity emerges from and returns to foundational humility about the limits of individual understanding. Those who see only foolishness in others have reversed this principle. They operate from the assumption that they've already grasped what others have missed, making them blind to the very wisdom that might complete their understanding. The intellectual virtue perspective. Research on intellectual humility reveals that truly wise people exhibit several key characteristics: acknowledging their own limitations without feeling defensive, recognizing that others' perspectives have value, being willing to admit ignorance and learn from others, showing empathy and openness even toward those who disagree. Conversely, those who see only foolishness in others display intellectual vices, arrogance, closed-mindedness, inability to recognize their own fallibility, and what researchers call epistemic injustice, denying others' capacity as knowers. The mirror principle in action. The cosmogram's holographic nature means that what you perceive in others reflects your own cognitive and spiritual state. When you consistently see foolishness in others while rarely acknowledging their wisdom, you reveal several things about yourself. limited perspective, you may be operating from such a narrow viewpoint that you cannot recognize wisdom expressed through different frameworks or approaches. Defensive cognition. Your need to see others as foolish may protect your ego from having to acknowledge your own limitations or the possibility of being wrong. Metacognitive blindness, like those affected by Dunning-Krueger, you may lack the very capacities needed to recognize good reasoning and insight when it appears in forms different from your own. The self-fulfilling nature of foolishness. Most profoundly, the act of seeing only foolishness in others actively prevents you from becoming wiser. Proverbs warns that fools despise wisdom and instruction. But this often manifests not as rejecting all teaching, but as rejecting wisdom when it comes through people you've labeled as foolish. The Cosmogram suggests that wisdom is distributed holographically throughout human experience. When you dismiss others as foolish, you're cutting yourself off from aspects of truth that are only accessible through their perspectives. You become trapped in what researchers call a closed epistemic loop, only accepting information that confirms what you already believe. The ultimate test. The truest test of wisdom is your capacity to recognize it in unexpected places and unlikely people. The Cosmogram's interconnected structure shows that wisdom emerges through relationship and mutual recognition. Those who consistently fail to see wisdom in others are failing the fundamental test of wisdom itself. Biblical wisdom captures this perfectly. God chooses the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. This suggests that true wisdom often appears in forms that conventional thinking dismisses as foolish. If you cannot recognize this possibility, you may be missing the very insights you most need. The path forward. The Cosmogram points toward a different approach. Assume that everyone you encounter possesses some aspect of wisdom that you lack. This doesn't mean accepting all ideas as equally valid, but rather approaching each person with what researchers call intellectual humility, the recognition that your understanding is partial and can be enriched through genuine engagement with others. As one philosopher notes, the wise have a posture of humility and a teachable heart, because humility comes with wisdom. The spiral's return to 4 in the Cosmogram reminds us that all genuine wisdom ultimately rests on the foundational recognition of our shared human capacity for insight and error alike. The fool sees only foolishness in others because they have made themselves incapable of learning. Not because others have nothing to teach, but because they have closed themselves off to the very relationships through which wisdom emerges. The deepest foolishness is believing you have nothing left to learn from those you oppose.